Right, Torsten, it is an exceptional privilege to have you on our Dream and Reality series in the history of geographic thought. Of all the people we've met, I think you perhaps typify most what I mean and what we both mean by the need for dialogue. There are many aspects of your work and thought which have not been adequately communicated in print, and there are many in the world who know a lot about what you've done and what you've been, but very few know much about who you are and so on. So I would like you to tell us very simply today something of your own life story and your reflections on what you've learned through that journey.
Well, I think I would like to begin with showing you a picture which I have taken myself of my home. When I went to school, I made actually a little study of my own home parish, and I included a picture of my home here, and I was also anxious to get myself on the picture to get me into the environment. You see, this is a little countryside schoolhouse, as they frequently look like up in Småland, the wooded backwood area in Sweden I come from. You see the ridges on both sides and the schoolhouse in the little valley. This is the place where I grew up, and you can see that it's actually rather isolated in the forest. Mm-hmm. And I think this isolation maybe in itself has some influence on my situation and perhaps my personality.
The fact that you enjoy being a little person, somewhat apart from the whole. But what about the school environment, your father and mother, and your relation to the environment of your childhood?
Yeah, let me first tell you a little bit about the environment. This location of the schoolhouse is in a way an example of optimal location, as geographers like to think of it, because it's just optimizing distances from the two settlements which sent the children to the school. On the one side here we had an old medieval village. Actually, in that village they had Iron Age and Bronze Age stones and so on. It's a very, very old settlement. And on the other side, about 1 mile on this side, was a fairly new factory town. And these two settlements could not agree who of them were going to have the school. And so we got an optimal and rational location, I suppose, in the middle, in the woods. And the school children came from both sides. But, you know, this caused also a lot of problems, at least for me personally, because there were many tensions between the two groups. And I tried at any case to be loyal to my father, who was a school teacher, and must at a very early date learn how to be neutral. And also it led to the fact that in the daytime, when the school children were there, I isolated myself quite a lot. I looked at their place more than took part in them. And my time came in the evening and at weekends when I was alone with my closest friends, 2 or 3 friends I had.
Mm-hmm. And you worked in the lab and worked around the schoolhouse and had a good time creating things even then. Yeah,
and I must say it surprises me almost today how much freedom my parents gave me. My mother tended to be a little nervous lady, but she actually let me play around in the woods as I looked, and I had a little boat on the stream outside and so on. And my father gave me all freedom. He had a little school lab and a library and so on. And when the school children were not there, I was left free to make experiments and do what I wanted, which I think was extremely helpful later.
Your father, I think, appreciated, or you felt he appreciated your inventiveness. He also approved very much of your doing experiments in the lab.
Yeah, he did. I remember as a very, very small child how my father, he's standing here with his class, I'm sitting just here. He went to a course in Göteborg. I think it must have been about 1921 or 22. It was before I started school, a course which was called Home Area Studies. They had a very inventive and active group of educators in Göteborg. Two names are worth naming, Sjöholm and Govers. Govers was the artist and Sjöholm was the teacher. And they wanted to introduce in the Swedish schools a kind of study which must have been about the same kind as Le Play had in France, or maybe the influences came from Germany, I don't know. But he came home from this course with great enthusiasm, you know, and started to do with my brother and me and his school children all sorts of things he had learned in that course. And I think that this is actually the start of my geography. I never chose geography as a field. I sort of grew into it somehow.
Yes, but you did this home area type mapping and describing your own local area.
Oh, I remember vividly. It's one of the only things I really remember from my first school years when we learned to make maps. You know, at that time the school discipline was very strict, and you had, when school started, you had to line up in a row outside and march into your place, and you must stand there until the schoolmaster said, please sit down, and so on. It was all half military almost. But that day, when we were going to make a map, first of the school room, we were left completely free. Somebody was standing up at the blackboard with a ruler and chalk, and the others were running around and measuring and shouting numbers back to the fellow at the blackboard, and it drew a map of the schoolroom. I remember that so vividly because suddenly we were completely free, you know, and we created something. And everybody else could understand the relationship between this abstract picture and his real place in the room, the bench. We put the names of the kids on the map and so on. So that was the way he approached it. And a little late, perhaps a week later and so on, we made a similar thing of the school yard. And as a third step came a map of the parish as a whole. But this we couldn't do ourselves, of course, so my father prepared a map 2 meters long or so, and I helped him, of course, since he made it home to do this, color it and so on, and then it was put up on the wall in the schoolroom.
That's really important, because I think that both your father's influence on you and the experience of putting together a map in a way, a sort of handicraft, artisan sort of way, both of those things appeal to you. Yes? Putting that map together was a very significant experience for you. You made a portrait of your father one time, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Oh, it was not, he was no longer alive, but I loved him very much, and I sort of tried to get him back to life again by trying to draw this portrait. It's made after a photography, of course.
But intellectually speaking, your father had a very strong German sort of background, isn't that true? Sort of idealist German, noblesse oblige, and liberal, political, and so on. Do you think his whole world view, in effect, got communicated to you?
Yes, and he used to. He was very fond of writing poetry. I don't think it was extremely outstanding, but he made verses, you know, for our Christmas gift and when we had a birthday and a school examination and so on. And there was always a little moral climax in it. So, for example, saying that you must make your duty in all weathers and that sort of thing. So I guess that had a profound influence on me, that's true.
So then you went to high school also in part of Småland, is that right?
Well, the high school was situated about 10 miles away, and there was no other way than going by train every morning and every night. And believe it or not, my father and a few of his friends managed to arrange the train to stop at our village so I could get on it and back again to school. This wouldn't be possible in today's society at all. At that time we were perhaps 2 or 3 kids who used the train, and they managed to make a little station. So,
that was very consistent.
Yes.
And then you came to Lund, yes, in 1930s.
I left school at 36, and then I had a year of military service up in the Stockholm area. And I came to Lund in autumn 1937. It was a funny day, you know, because when I went on the train, my parents followed me down. It was a long journey at that time, you know, and you were going to disappear for half a year. They weighed me at me, and when I came into the coupe, there was an old beard man who used to be a kind of missionary and who had visited my home many times. He was also an old school teacher, and he was on his way out to Denmark or Germany. So we had company all the time. And when we came to Lund, to the station, he followed me out on the platform, you know. And when I had taken leave of him, he raised his hand like that, you see, and blessed me. I remember this so vividly. He had white, long beard, you know, and everybody turned around and looked at the funny couple standing there. But that was that's how I entered Lund.
Fantastic. With aplomb. And Lund has really been the seat of your major life experience in a way, since 1937.
Yes, since then I have lived here. I have had my home here except for a shorter period. That's true.
Well, that's a good 40 years of straight academic commitment, and it's during those 40 years that you have done the things we've all heard about. Now, in the geography department at that time, could you describe a little how it was?
Well, my teacher at that time, Helge Nilsson, I guess he was a kind of Hartsonian geographer who laid stress on the regional perspective, a regional approach. But he was not very good at explaining this or making it, should I say,
systematic.
Yeah, he worked himself so intuitively. I'm sure he had a tremendous feeling for relationships and an understanding of how things hang together in a region. But he could only demonstrate how he himself reasoned and so on to his students. But he could never really go further than that. So it was very hard. It took a very, very long time before you got a kind of grasp of what he intended. But then, in addition, he had a strong historical sense. To him, geographic explanation was to follow the development of an area from as far back in time as you could up to now. And of course, Sweden, with its outstanding archives of historical maps and its population registers and so on, could be a laboratory for that kind of research. Then teaching, the interesting parts of the teaching was field work. For example, we made mapping in the field and went around to make all sorts of observations, interviewing people and so on. This was, at least to my mind, the most interesting part of it. But I must say, when I came here, I was not really determined to become a geographer then. Well, let me put it that way. I knew that I didn't want to become a school teacher. I haven't got enough of that at home. Yeah. So this had to be avoided at any price.
Okay.
But you had to have certain combination of fields. So in case it turned out to be impossible to make a university career, you could always turn to teaching. It was a sort of a reserve outlet. And I think that it might have been my mother who was responsible for this attitude. Because as a young girl, she was closely attached to a priest family up in Småland, Plejel. And one of their boys had gone to Lund and become, at that time, an associate professor or something, and he was supposed later on to become a professor. And he was the model. So everything we made something wrong in my home, or she always said they never had they were never allowed to do like that in the Barkerids, the vicarage, and so on. This was the model place, you know, and it sort of became taken for granted that the only respectable thing is to make an academic career. And believe it or not, this old man who was my model, Hilding Plejel, he's still emeritus professor. You met him here. He's still alive in Lund. But you see how these connections go.
So you sort of placed your bets, as it were, in a variety of places.
I
all
did.
of them were alternatives to being just a teacher.
Exactly.
And
So
these areas included those areas that you were pursuing.
yeah, actually, my what I had hoped to start study was ethnology, because my father, in his later years, he built up together with friends a little local museum, and this interested me very much. I went around and measured old buildings and picked up old things and so on, and helped him to arrange this. And when this museum was opened, that was in 1938, he wrote a prologue in his ordinary kind of poetry.
Germanic.
Yes, and he says at the end that this museum is testimony of the forefathers' life and heavy work, and he hopes that later generations should learn here, get visible knowledge of times past. That was extremely important for him, the visibility of things and the tangibility, you know, and it still is for me.
Yes, it still is for you. Very much.
And I contributed to this by making this little sketch or picture of a country house in typical little cottage in Småland. But you see, when I came to Lund, then what they dealt with in ethnology was folklore more than material culture or the more tangible parts of culture. By the way, the professor here, his name was Wilhelm von Sydow. He was the father of Max von Sydow, the famous Ingmar Bergman actor. But he was almost exclusively interested in tales, folk tales and poetry and so on, and I was not at all interested in that. So I tried what I could find closest, art history and geography. And I spent 1 year with both fields simultaneously, and finally then, more by accident, I suppose, I was asked by Sven Björnsson, who was then associate professor in physical geography, to come with him to a field station up in the Summen area, in the Östergötland area, to spend the summer there for my first term paper. And so I did. It was a magnificent landscape. I got very much attracted to it. And when I came back, they asked me if I wanted to become a teaching assistant in the geography department, and then I was there. You see, and I can also explain why this happened so easily. My father had died in 19 38, and my mother could not support me at all, so I had to borrow money. But along with this teaching assistantship, you got a free accommodation in the geography department.
Yes.
You had almost a kind of feudal system at that time, so you got in natura, so to speak, a room. And for that you had to do 6 hours a week in library or assisting the professor and so on. And clearly I accepted that. It was a great subsidy for me. And that's how they hooked me up in geography.
So that was in Solvigatan.
That was in Solvigatan.
And you lived there and worked there.
We lived there and worked there, yes.
And who were the most important teachers or influences during that period of your undergraduate years, which were, I understand, 37 to about 40, yes?
Yeah, in this period it was no doubt colleague-based who had an approach to geography which I could appreciate, and also he had the same interest in mapping, in what was visible and tangible, and he made marvelous field excursions. I learned to know this area by heart around here and so on. And I think what he could bring over most of all was the art of observation. He was a morphologist. It doesn't per se interest me very much, but to go out to work with him was very helpful. You learned how to look at things and draw
and
conclusions.
Helge Nelson was your supervisor, yes? He was
Yes.
chairman.
Yeah.
But there also was Edgar Kant in those years.
Yeah, but he came later. He came as a refugee from Estonia at the end of the 1944, I think it was.
It was later then.
So it was later, and he got some sort of stipend to stay at the department and make a geographical dictionary. I think it was a crazy idea, but he started to do that in any case, and he had the ambition to go back to the original sources for every term he found. So I think he was a very learned man already before, but after that he started to read almost everything which had been printed that could vaguely be called geography, So he became a living encyclopedia. Whatever question you had, he knew everything, and he had a strong personal interest, so he knew also all sorts of things about the authors personally. Letter writing was his main preoccupation.
He had a marvelous handwriting.
Oh yes, yeah.
Beautiful. So he taught you, though, a good deal, didn't he?
Yeah, he did in a peculiar way, because I was asked to become his assistant to begin with. He could know Swedish, and he needed somebody who could translate his things, And also, I was asked to pick up Swedish terms for the German and English and French and what have you. He came up with. So we spent day after day, 2 hours a day, I think, for a couple of years in his smoky room, and most of the time we talked about all sorts of things except what we were supposed to do, I think. So I learned a lot from him, and he opened the windows towards Europe. Of course, he had studied in Paris, in Amsterdam, in Hungary,
and also to the world of demographic statistics and migration models and things like that. He had worked a little with that.
Yes and no. When I met him, I had already worked on population analysis, and my work on migration was almost finished before I met him. I think what he showed me was this possibility to summarize in mathematical formulas and so on. But what was really new was his social geography, which he talked about. He never published anything in Swedish, and his Estonian publications are not accessible to us here. But he talked a lot about his studies of Tartu in Estland, where he had actually mapped the activity spaces of various social classes, and he even showed pictures of the homes of various social classes. And this was so dramatically impossible for us here, because being a geographer was to be out in the field and look at the landscape, but to include the inside of people's homes into the concept of the landscape was absolutely new. But I think actually prepared me for the kind of things you have you have taught me, because this was the first step towards actually taking the human being seriously, not just as an artifact in the landscape.
Oh, I've been amazed at Kant's studies, what Grauner showed us in Finland and so on. In 1920 already he was doing things like Parkenbergers were doing in Chicago.
Oh, he would have been a classic if that had been translated that time.
Absolutely. So now then you went to field work. We can't get lost altogether on Solveigatan. You went to Osby, back to the same area where you had done this summer camp.
Yeah.
And you did some work there which was of a general regional kind to satisfy the requirements of the licentiate.
Exactly.
Doctorate.
Yeah. You see, one of the peculiar features of this department was that it was not really problem-oriented. Perhaps it was a good thing. One had to find out oneself what to do. But nobody told you anything. You just was sent to an area and told, study this area. And, when you start from the beginning, you don't know what to do. So what I actually did to start with was to look at the relationship between settlement and morphology. It was a natural thing at the time when you did see human and physical geography as a unit. But I couldn't get out much of interest of that. So instead I said to myself, let me see if one can establish a closer understanding of how people actually use the resources they have in the area, and how can one do that? Well, in this area, it lay near at hand to look at what happened after the immigration to United States. This area was the one, I think, where immigration to America started. Yeah, and thousands of people left. And there must have been significant adjustments in the area afterwards. And I said to myself, if I could follow this population movement, perhaps I could establish a relationship between population movement and the livelihood possibilities they had and so on.
And that's where the major idea behind the migration diffusion model was born, in fact. Even though you didn't articulate it as a model before 47.
No, Britt and I started on a sort of impossible empirical work, but we didn't understand when we started what it would be. We simply decided to follow in the church registers, a kind of population archaeology, every individual who had lived in that parish for 100 years. And we spent 2 summers, day after day, on this job. We went to the vicarage and got the old books, and then through the village to the place where we lived, and then we sat until late evening and back again to the vicarage. And by doing this, you finally got acquainted with the whole population in a personal way somehow. And this experience has colored my whole worldview. To follow people like this, how they were born, they moved around, they married, they got children, they died, they were sick and poor, and all sorts of things happened, and you could follow everything on it. And you can see a population as a system, as a kind of vegetation, So when you went out in the streets and met people, you could in your mind see back in time where these particular people came from. And from that moment I came to something struck me here, which I think I had in me before, and this was the possibility or the necessity to combine geography and time, not history, but time, in a different way than one had tried to do before. Instead of seeing time as a series of cross-sections, jumps between cross-sections, I would rather like to see processes ongoing like this, unbroken. And that's, in a sense, the only idea I have had in my life, and that's what I have been working on all the time.
But you let it go to sleep, as it were.
I did, yes.
And went off on this diffusion model, which sold like hotcakes in the Anglo world.
Yes.
But tell me about that, this diffusion model. Was that a sort of a short circuit on your great love, as it were?
Absolutely. Yes, you see, I had to make this first licentiate degree, which approximately corresponds to a PhD, in 1947. And for that, I picked out on this mass of data just the internal moves of this rural population inside Sweden. And I had the hypothesis to begin with that people were very stable back in time, and that as technology developed and so on, mobility would increase and so. But this was not at all the case. The mobility had not changed very much over the 100 years. People moved around quite as much as that time as they do now. It's only that distances were slightly shorter, but not very much, you know. And in these migration fields, there were also anomalies. So certain areas were preferred destinations and others avoided and so on. And this pattern also were the same decade after decade. So then, when I had finished this study, it struck me that here must be something. The stability, how did people get to know about jobs at that time? Only by gossip. That must have been the only way, or meetings at markets and so on. In other words, the migration pattern must depict very closely the social network structure. But if that is so, I said to myself, then also ideas must move in this network. So let me see if it works. If I take what I know about migration and let model-wise an idea start somewhere, let's see if it moves outwards as if this communication system exists. And as you know, it worked reasonably well. I could computerize this and show that it worked. But my main interest was really not diffusion, the process. I used that in order to show that there is a stable communication network. And after I had made this study in 1953, I started to see if I could get more direct access to the network, first of all on the Swedish and later on the European level. So I spent much time on, for example, accepting lists from festschrifts. Who know whom. That was what I was interested in. And for 1 month I had 40 European daily newspapers to see who speak about whom, all in an effort to try to see if I could figure out a kind of structure in the communication, social communication network of Europe.
So in a way, you had graduated a long way from the schoolboy looking out of the schoolroom window, wondering about how the farm population interacted and how the industrial kids interacted. Now you were looking at Europe or Sweden in terms of who interacted with whom and what shapes it. But this older timeline interest was still asleep when you, by the late 50s, when you started getting interested in regional science and more quantitative regional work.
Yeah, for various reasons, I came into the planning activities, and one of the problems we had at that time was the great discrepancies in access to services, school, healthcare, and so on in Sweden. And it struck me that perhaps this time use approach could be a way of looking into it could be a way of getting a firm grasp on how access to things influence the lives and possibilities, opportunities of people. And then, of course, those old ideas from the 40s came back, but at the micro scale.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I didn't hesitate to apply a micro scale because of the teaching I had from Edgar Kant, who had told me that a geographer can go all the way from the details and up to the globe.
Right, right. But there was that period in the 50s when you were actually teaching and you became a professor and all this. You had to let your research interests take second place, as it were, to your administrative work.
Yes, from 57 and up to, well, for 10 years ahead, I did very little research because the time was full with
well,
teaching.
you did some probes abroad during that period. Like in 57, you were in Edinburgh, right?
That's right. I was invited to Edinburgh and there I lectured about my diffusion models, but I was out too early. There was very little interest in that. But on the other hand, I met Arthur Geddes, the son of Patrick Geddes, and was introduced in his family. They treated me extremely kindly and took me around in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And through him I learned to know the Geddes family, the Outlook Tower and this whole urban planning ideology, which influenced me quite a lot, I think, in the work I later on made on urbanization.
But you see, you had actually come to Edinburgh and later to Seattle with wares that hadn't been seen before in the Anglo world, virtually. The quantification of spatial pattern. It was something that was there already in the logic of what we were doing, but it hadn't really been done. And I remember being told I should read The Propagation of Innovation Waves, and I had a hard time understanding what this had to do with geography, you know, in Seattle. So you went to Seattle in 59. Yes? This was during your administration period, in fact. You were professor.
Yes, I got a leave of absence for spending time in
Can you describe that experience of being in America with these models you had developed?
Well, first of all, I was surprised to find a group of people there who were at all interested in this, because the Seattle group, Bill Garrison and Dick Morrill and John Nyston and so on, they were so dissimilar to what I had expected. Having read Geographical Review and Annals and so on, I didn't expect to find that people who were so congenial. And on the other hand, when I became closer acquainted with them, I saw also different. I was genuinely interested in subject matter, so to speak, whereas they were much more interested in techniques, analytical techniques, and they were much more interested in developing statistical test methods and so on, and I was more interested in trying to build a kind of societal world picture. The diffusion study, migration study, and so in my mind all were aspects of a sort of total picture of how a society living in a region, how it functioned, whereas they were more interested in technique.
Well, if my image of the situation is correct, my impression is that there were two irreconcilable camps at that time, the ideographic and the nomothetic. The people who thought that all geography should be about the unique and the comprehensive and so on, or those who felt that geography should be law-seeking and methodologically sophisticated. And there was very little communication between the two camps, and I think what was attractive about your visit was that you were interested in the whole picture, but you still had the hardware, you know, which would enable you to be almost nomothetic about the whole picture. So it was your and they still told me many times when I was a student at Washington that your diagrams on the boards and the little sketches you did on serviettes and so on were things that gave them their dissertation ideas of and so on. But you felt that they were just interested in the hardware.
It's not fair to say that, but they were at least the leading persons there seemed to be that. But some of them, let's say, like Dick Morrill and so, I think he was quite close to me, and he came over to Sweden then and made a study.
Yes. Well, Dick was my teacher, so
Yeah.
I probably got a good version of what you were all about.
Yeah.
Yes. But your impressions of America, supposed to...
Yeah, after the period in Seattle, we, Britt and I, made a 6-week tour through America. First by Greyhound bus, which is a way of getting to the backsides of American cities, I suppose. And then in Louisville, our friends Arnold Anderson and Gene Bauman from Chicago came down and brought us around to Tennessee and Kentucky and so on, and up to Washington, D.C. by car. So we could stop anywhere and take pictures and so on. I have a marvelous picture collection, which I have not fully mounted yet. But I must say, I was sort of, my attitude to America became then very much schizophrenic in a sense. I have never found so kind and open people. In many respects, I feel at home there. I feel free. I like to be there. At the same time, I cannot understand how these nice people can accept to have an environment and the social conditions as they had. You know, it struck me as so improbable, this contradiction, you know. And the cities, particularly the city centers, were so appalling, you cannot believe it. And the big technological marvels they had and were proud of, I couldn't understand it at all, and how they spread junk in the landscape and how they handled their poor and so on. So when I came back from America, I spent a year or two moving around to planning meetings and so on, talking about car traffic. We had very little of that in Sweden at that time, and I tried to tell them what I should do in order to avoid to get the city centers destroyed and so on and so forth. But nobody listened to that. But anyway, I think I found some sort of justification for the planning work I went into, because I sort of said to myself, if we let industry and technology go as it want, then we quickly get that kind of society. And I suppose this was my father's idealism. I didn't like to see Sweden develop in that way.
So you went straight into that regional development project, didn't you? After you got back from the early 60s?
Yes, the early 60s. The first thing we did was to try to reform the administrative system. Yeah.
That was one of your major works.
Yes.
And that was a cooperative exercise. And the idea was to have a more rational organization of communes.
Yeah, rational, that's correct, one can say that, but the goal was to find a way of leveling out differences between the wealthy and the more poorer strata in the population, so that wealth you had in urban areas should be transferred to the surrounding rural areas. This was the main idea behind it.
And as you look back, that regional phase really lasted from 1960 until...
Till 70?
Yeah, a whole decade. Yes.
76 or so, yes. Yeah.
And did that project allow you an opportunity to bring back this older fascination with lifelines and so on, or was it quite distinct, in fact?
No, this work... I tried to work on two lines. One was fairly straightforward practical studies, easy to understand and so on. And then I set off some of the resources for more pure theoretical work. And finally that side of the matter became the most important. And by 1971, the Social Science Research Council decided to give me a personal research chair, so I could...
That's when you picked up your
Yes,
individual
yeah.
ideas.
And at that time I had tried to write about it in a general way in a little working group headed by Alva Myrdal, called To Choose a Future.
Yes.
And there I maintain that we must describe society in a way that we respect the indivisibility and integrity of the individual. We must have a sort of people understanding of society instead of a role understanding as political scientists have.
Yes, I remember when we first met, that was in 71, that was a point that really, in fact, surprised me that you, of all people, would be interested in individuals and in the experience of individuals, because all that had been produced in print was that which could have been produced by a big sort of operation of aggregate research on regional problems and transport and so on.
Yeah, but you see, I have this picture from the 40s, from my work, or Brits and my work on the population registers. I had only never been able to give it a conceptual structure, so I could take it out and show people how I saw this. And then when I met you, you gradually came me to understand that it's absolutely okay to take a look at a single individual, even to look at yourself, which is
especially
at yourself. And this is absolutely a logical conclusion of what I tried to do in the 40s. But given the way people understood geography or so, how could you dare to try to do that at that time? But now I find it fascinating, of course, to use my own way of describing the population through time on myself.
Yes,
I have actually made a diagram here of my own life story, or a couple of diagrams. So here is Europe. I have indicated the most important places where I've been doing serious work. And then these are the places through the 20th century. And I have marked where I have been trying to do something, or where I have existed.
And in the background are some world events like the 2 world wars, I take it.
For example, yes. But also the emergence of new technologies, for example, broadcasting, television, air transportation, and what have you. And you have all those important books in influencing people's scientific understanding and so on. It could all be brought in into a picture like that.
Even looking at that, you can see how much the trip to America, which isn't shown here, but it was 59, yes?
It was 59,
it was this
yes.
year.
Yeah.
How that, in a way, was the opening onto a very intense period of international activity.
Yeah, I have tried to. It's maybe a little bit confusing to see this, but I have actually tried to show where in Europe and also in America I have been active. So these are the spots in Europe where I have one or several times been lecturing or had seminars or conferences and so on. And this is the time when it happened. And then I have tried to indicate what kind of interests I had. So these places and this period is dominated by talk about diffusion. And then from 1969, when I had this address in Copenhagen, what about people and regional science? The whole scene is dominated by this so-called time geography. It's not my invention, this term. I don't know who invented it, but it seems to be there now. And in the meantime, there is some work on migration and on geocoding and some other things I've been involved in.
Do you think that time geography effort gave you a chance to marry those 2 interests you have? One, the kind of methodological interest in using clever little ways of combining data and so on methodologically, and the other interest of planning society and taking care of leveling out differences and so on. Do you think it has succeeded in doing that?
Yeah, in a sense, I think it makes me understand something which I also picked up in a paper by Vining, I think it was, that planning is essentially a question of distributing constraints. It's not a question of telling people what to do. But there are some things which they shouldn't do. So
it's police?
No, not necessarily. This must be agreed upon. But there are things that's my view. You might see it otherwise, I suppose. But let's take this idea of a new administrative division. The purpose was not to force people to do any particular things inside this. It was only to define which population groups were to cooperate. And if you leave that to themselves, we had in the 50s a first try there, and you found then that nobody wanted to have to do with the poor areas.
Mm-hmm. So you forced them into it?
Yeah, I think it's right.
Uh-huh.
You shouldn't. If you forget those in society who are weak, you should be forced not to forget. I think that.
Uh-huh. No comment?
Yeah, that's up to you.
So this is your definition of planning, and it has a great aesthetic appeal also, because you can discover a language which in fact enables you to see the orchestra playing, as it were. You've written the score, as it were, for how the orchestra is going to play.
Yeah, I'm not interested in writing the score, perhaps, but I think it's a way of seeing things which I believe has an educative value, and people can argue about their conflicts in a more quiet way, perhaps, if they can see relationships between their ways of seeing things a little better.
And you really believe in your language, but it wasn't always lines and dots. You also were interested in musical notation, weren't you?
Well, I was actually. Sometimes I dreamed of being a composer, and I have a notebook here where I put down melodies. I ran around in the woods and listened to birds and tried to imitate what their songs and so on. Made plans for great symphonies and so on. But this was not serious. But you see, there is something here about the same time as my father taught me how to make maps. Mm-hmm. My mother taught me how to make notation of music. I learned to play then. And it was about the same time I found that you can depict things graphically even if you cannot see them.
Yes.
So at the same time as I learned how to make maps of what I can see, I learned to make graphical pictures of something you cannot see but just hear. And so this language representation has always fascinated me very
And
much.
music was very attractive, and maybe that was part of the motivation behind the time modeling of society and activities and so on.
Yeah, I believe that whatever I had been going into anthropology or history or language or whatever, I would have ended up with dealing with time.
But I think there are other questions that puzzle a lot of us, puzzle me still, and we've talked a lot. It's this question of what you mean by an individual, and whether that individual is something that has to be administered or policed or organized institutionally or geographically, objectively, let's say, or whether an individual is, in fact, some person that can be trusted to take responsibility and therefore should not be therefore so constrained. There seems to be those two aspects of the individual. I still don't understand how they fit together in your head.
No.
See, on the one hand, you want freedom for the individual to play and be creative and write music if he wants, or something else. But on the other hand, on the social planning and regionalization of Sweden, you can believe that one can come to a definite collective decision about what's right for everybody.
No, we have a political system in which people's representatives at least formally make the choice, and I guess all societies must have some sort of ordering institutions. So my conception of the whole thing is that freedom as much as possible, but under certain constraints. And I think this goes back to large extent to my American visit, where I saw the consequences of what I think is excesses in freedom.
Uh-huh. You think it's excessive, the kind of freedom Americans have?
Yes, the way they use it. But if they could show a little more restraints individually, okay then. This language maybe could be used in teaching to show the consequences for others of what you yourself are doing. And this is something which makes me so nervous about modern technology. Okay, those engineers and administrators who invent it, they have great fun. But then they kill the fun for everybody else fairly soon, as soon as they have laid their system upon the whole.
What about the fun you kill when you decide where they ought to live and move and so on?
No, but there is nothing of that kind in this. It's no question of deciding where people have to move, but it is a question of them to know who they cooperate with when they come to a new place.
Well, you have had an enormous range of interests and involvements institutionally and project-wise and everything else. What are some of the major lessons that you feel worth communicating? You've reflected a bit on all your activities and their sequence and so on. What would be the kind of advice you would be inclined to give, say, a young student in geography or somebody in my stage of life and so on? Are there lessons you've learned from this journey?
Yes, I think this lesson has to do with what we talked about just now. I would like to believe in the individual just as you do, the only way I can see now in avoiding control is education. So perhaps one of geographers' main tasks today is not so much planning, because we have seen also that even if you take a couple of steps in the best intention for reaching some goal, something else happens and everything goes in some other direction. But if one could get people in general to understand interrelationships a little better, perhaps one could help to establish this very delicate balance there must be between freedom and constraint.
But would you take that education not just to the people but to the administrators as well?
No, absolutely not to the administrators.
Why? Why?
No, they would quickly use it in their interests.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean have them administer education, but I meant to educate them on the kinds of things that geography can help people to understand.
Okay, I have no particular preferred group here, but I actually think in the present situation in Sweden it would be most important to get ordinary to understand a little better how things hang together around.
But from your own experience, personally, what have been the most important lessons? What have been the things that have been most valuable to you? Have there been moments of fresh insight? Have there been, success in getting status and so on? What are the moments that stand out as being particularly significant for you?
Well, these status questions we can forget. I don't care much for that. The moments when I can sit together with somebody who responds and play around with ideas, that's the high spots in life, really. Even if they are absolutely useless, but only to create ideas and see how they combine. That has been the most positive side of this being a university person. And unfortunately, as the universities have developed now, there is much less opportunity to it than it used to be.
Why?
Yeah, I don't know. There are so many barriers between students and teachers, and it's much more difficult than it used to be.
Let me ask you one last question, because I know I'm making you tired. What do you think is Sweden's contribution, even if you take it within our own field of geography? When I was a student, it was clear. We ramshackle little old regional geographers had to learn how to be systematic, and Sweden was kind of the symbol of everything sophisticated in that realm. 10 years, 15 have perhaps passed. How long? What do you think is Sweden's enduring contribution to the international community of geographers, as you might see it?
Well, that is extremely hard for me to say, I must say. But a contribution we could give in the future is to invite people to come here and take a look on both the positive and the negative sides of what has been achieved here. And one of the most important things we must develop methods for is to learn from each other. I came back from America in '59 and tried to tell people a little bit about the technological development there. Nobody listened. We don't know exactly yet how to transfer experience from country to country. But if we could find ways of doing that a little better, then I think we might have achieved something.
Well, I think you have done more in one lifetime to promote that than any of us can ever hope to do, in a very personal way, in a very helpful way. And there are many people all over the world who are grateful to you and don't have a medium through which to say it. So let's hope we can open up the doors to a more lively two-way communication in the future. Thank you very much for telling us all this.
Thank you very much for coming to Sweden and open my eyes to many problems I had not been able to see on my own.
Thank you.